Before we get into 17, I kind of wanted to just kind of recap and finish off those two verses. And so we were talking about the marriage or the unity between a believer and unbeliever. And remember, at the time of the church in Corinth there, and also this time in Christianity, you had a lot of people that were becoming Christians who were married prior to that. And so that's what he's addressing as far as the question to him on unbelievers being married to believers and vice versa. Do they stay? Do they depart because of the unequalness? And he's like, basically, you start where you are. And that's what we're going to get into this part of this morning is begin where you begin. If they were willing to stay, stay. But if they wanted to depart, they were not hitched to them, because under some of the study I was doing, it showed that like in a Jewish tradition, if a Jewish person left that faith, they were considered dead. And so that would, basically there was a separation there. So not full on those. I'm not fully educated on that. It was just something I was reading and kind of trying to make it all make sense. But so in verse 15, if the unbeliever departs, let him depart. A brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases. But God has called us to peace. For how do you know, O wife, whether you will save your husband, or how do you know, O husband, whether you will save your wife? So looking into verse 16, let's turn to Romans chapter 11. In Romans 11, starting in verse 13, I am talking to you, Gentiles. Inasmuch as I am the apostle to the Gentiles, I take pride in my ministry, in the hope that I may somehow arouse my own people to envy and save some of them. For if their rejection brought reconciliation to the world, what will their acceptance be but life from the dead? And then also 1 Peter 3:1. Wives, in the same way, submit yourselves to your own husbands, so that if any of them do not believe the word, they may be won over without words by the behavior of their wives, when they see the purity and reverence of your lives. So going back into this 1 Peter chapter 3, won over without words. Do our actions speak louder than our words? Absolutely. You can't just talk. You got to walk. You got to show it. Can a husband be saved through his wife? I heard a yes, and I've seen some head shaking no.
Depends on how you mean that.
Depends on how you. So, and I think this is where we get some context out. When somebody reads this, there was, and I thought I had it. When you read verse 3 here, and there's been some men that have put stock in this: if my wife goes to church and my wife is baptized and my wife is saved, then I'm good. I don't think that's what this is saying. So that if they do not believe the word, they may be won over without words by the behavior of their wives. Basically, the wife makes the husband see Christ to become a Christian, and vice versa. The husband should see the godliness in his wife that will lead him to Christ, but he must make that decision and that commitment. Likewise, the wife should see godliness in her husband that would lead her to Christ in the same way. So this being won over without words, I don't want us to get the wrong idea that we think that just because our spouse is saved that, and we just, we're married to them, that we're in, because that covenant and that unification there that we're in, because it's a you and God. And even though when you become a married couple, it's y'all and God, there still is that you component, husband and wife. And I think when we go back to what Paul was talking about, the married and the unmarried, and those staying as he was, it was a little bit easier for him because it was just him and God, not him, his spouse, and God. But anyway, back to that verse. I just wanted to touch on that because there's been, at times we've had these comments or we've had these discussions, and it's like, well, what does this mean? Doesn't mean that just because you're married to a Christian, you're going to make it. You've got to make that decision on your own. But they should be done through the behavior of that spouse. So going back to here, where he's talking about in 1 Corinthians, how do you know whether you will save your husband, or how do you know whether you will save your wife? By living a Christian life, you have a better chance of bringing the unbeliever to become a believer in that covenant of marriage. And the yep.
Should all be letting Christ be shown through their life. The influence on the other.
Absolutely. And again here, I'll put more weight on the husband's shoulders because there's statistics and there's studies that shown that church departure, when the husband, the father, was the one going to church, the family went. The family stayed faithful, more so than if the mother quit going. But if the father quit going, it was a higher percentage of the whole family not going anymore and becoming unfaithful. And so, again, there's a lot of weight on men's shoulders, but that's why we have to be men. That's why we need to be men of God, is because we do have to carry that weight. And we should carry that weight. Okay, so back into verse 17. We'll move into live as you are called, as my section labels it or addresses it. Verses 17 and 18, but as God has distributed to each one, as the Lord has called each one, so let him walk. And so I ordain in all the churches, was anyone called while circumcised? Let him not become uncircumcised. Was anyone called while uncircumcised? Let him not be circumcised. We'll go on through 19. Circumcision is nothing and uncircumcision is nothing, but keeping the commandments of God is what matters.
This is quite a big of an issue with the Jews and accepting the Gentiles.
Absolutely.
Big issue.
And Paul here has tied it together with the marriage of a believer to an unbeliever. Because this was something he's had to address before, whether those, the circumcision and that covenant. But can you become uncircumcised? Physically, no. So he addresses that broader question outside of the marriage question to an unbeliever on starting where you are when you're called. Verse 19, he kind of sums it up. Circumcision is nothing and uncircumcision is nothing, but keeping the commandments of God is what matters. When we start to put differences among us for hierarchy on where you are in your church, in your community, in your Christian life, things like that, we have unyoked ourselves or become unequivalent to everyone else. And we're not there. We're not privileged of that because we're all equal. We're all children of God. And so we're all sinners. So it's not like we've got one that's less of a sinner than the other because we're all sinners and we put it all in that same bucket under Christ. So when we start trying to separate because he's this or they're that, that's not how it's supposed to be in the church.
When you remember that Peter's problem, when Paul came into his midst, I forget exactly which one it was, Peter pulled himself apart from the group because it had some proselyting Jews that came in.
Yep.
And so Paul said, this is not right. You can't do that. You've got to go ahead and be with them. You're a Christian, they're a Christian, that's it. It's not what you were, it's what you are now.
Exactly. So that Paul bringing it all back in on this between believer and unbeliever, Jew and Gentile, he's bringing it all back in to get them to understand his whole message of unity, pretty much. And we can't separate, because he's a Christian now, he can't separate himself from the Jews because they need to save just as much as the Gentiles did. They needed to hear Christ just as much as the Gentiles or anybody else. So keeping God's commands is what counts. Let's turn to Romans chapter 2, 25 through 39. Romans chapter 2, starting in verse 25. Circumcision has value if you observe the law, but if you break the law, you have become as though you had not been circumcised. So then, if those who are not circumcised keep God's requirements, will they not be regarded as though they were circumcised? The one who is not circumcised physically and yet obeys the law will condemn you, who, even though you have the written code and circumcision, are a lawbreaker. A person is not a Jew who is the one only outwardly, nor is circumcision merely outward and physical. No, a person is a Jew who is one inwardly, and circumcision is circumcision of the heart by the Spirit, not by the written code. Such a person's praise is not from other people, but from God. Galatians 5:6. For in Christ Jesus, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision has any value. The only thing that counts is faith expressing itself through love. And then also in chapter 6, verse 15. Neither circumcision nor uncircumcision means anything. What counts is the new creation. And then Colossians 3:11. Here there is no Gentile or Jew, circumcised or uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave or free, but Christ is all and is in all. So Paul pretty much, in these 4 verses, he kind of wraps it all up to what he's saying here. There should not be any difference. Likewise, between the circumcised and uncircumcised, Gentile and Jew, believer and unbeliever, if they were in that marriage covenant and they decided to stay, he saw no law of God being broken in that covenant. Just keep in mind, too, Paul is facing a lot of persecution, right? The Christians, because of the difference in their belief, the difference in tradition, the difference in belief in what they had been taught their whole lives through Judaism and everything. So he's facing a lot of opposition. And they're trying to figure out or pinpoint any little thing they can to discredit what he's talking about now. But they're not able to do so because it's God's word through Paul that he's talking. And we kind of covered my next question, why did Paul use the circumcision as his example? That was one of the biggest things that they were trying to pull and push against as to credit or discredit as well, because their law of circumcision and what that meant. And Paul's trying to, basically nip it in the bud. He's trying to get it shut down because it's causing dissension and separation in the church. So back in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 20, let each one remain in the same calling in which he was called. We're going through 24. Were you called while a slave? Do not be concerned about it. But if you can be made free, rather use it. For he who is called in the Lord while a slave is the Lord's freed man. Likewise, he who is called while free is Christ's slave. You were bought at a price. Do not become slaves of men. Brethren, let each one remain with God in that state in which he was called. So another, issue that come up. When slaves became Christians, were they freed from their bondservant or from their master? No. Now, if that master became a Christian and released them, they were released. But as he's saying here, when your Christian status changes, your status on earth may not change. Roll with it. Where you are, use that to your advantage. Use that. You can be an example to your master. You can be an example to your others, your peers, the other slaves that are in the same bondage that you are. Remain in the situation you are in, and do not let your situation deter you from following Christ. You begin where you are and change what you can as you can.
I have an example of you, but you
Mm-hmm.
There's kind of another example of what you're saying.
Pleading for the slave's life, because when the slave deserted, what was the punishment? Death. But he pleaded to spare his life, let him return, and let him, And again, keeping with the laws of the land, even as we keep the laws of Christ, to keep unity amongst that, to where we're not lawbreakers in the land, to also not be lawbreakers with Christ. Now, is it easy to remain in the situation you were in when you become a Christian? Depends on your situation. I heard a saying the other day that was like, you cannot change the people around you, but you can change the people around you. You can't change the person, but you can change who you're hanging out with. And so that's one of the things about being a Christian. We can't change those people unless we do it through our actions, but we can change those people that we put around us as influences. So we think about that, for those in school, those in work situations, things like that. We can't change that person, but we can change our role and how we react to them and how they see us in our reaction to some of the things they do.
I think sometimes in the workplace, Christians do tend to get maybe better jobs because they're found to be more trustworthy.
Okay?
I've seen that throughout my career, that it seems like if I can trust you or you can be trusted, you're going to probably move up faster than those that can.
It's a good point. It's one of those things that people that, when I look at news stories, things like people want to bash Christianity, I'm like, but why are you so against it? Because if we're following Christ, if we're being true followers of Christ, what are we doing that's so mean and bad to you? We don't agree with what you believe a lot, but we're not out there persecuting you for it. We're not out there hating you for it, or we shouldn't be. I mean, there's probably some Christian groups that do go to the extreme on that, and that's probably giving us all a bad name. But when you think about it, we're usually very, easygoing, trustworthy. When we think about the Christ likeness and we put that in our life, we could be a better employee. We could be a better spouse. We could be a better parent. There's a lot of things that we could be better at because of that attitude and that the belief that we have, our faith, can make us at least a better person. There was one because I had a comment that even if you don't believe in Jesus, that's fine. Okay, we're not going to argue his existence, but read what he stood for. Understand his virtues. Are those not good? Is that not a good way to live? Whether you agree with any of that or not, would you not agree that the things he set forth are not a good path or pattern for society and people to live in harmony with each other? It's hard to deny that. So whether you want to believe he was real or not, his teachings are pretty solid. It makes a lot of sense for peace. Anything else on that? Because that section right there is kind of on, living where you're called. And then we get to the where he addresses the unmarried and the widows. Verse 25, now concerning virgins, I have no commandment from the Lord, yet I give judgment as the one whom the Lord in his mercy has made trustworthy. So again, Paul's using his authority under Christ by his teachings to give, advice or direction on this. About virgins or unmarried. Do you see the association there? The virgins, the unmarried, being faithful until marriage, abstinence. That's kind of what he's pulling it together here when he addresses the virgins, the unmarried. So just putting that out there, there's the association. In Paul's day and still today in Christianity and in the church, sexual intimacy is reserved for marriage. We understand that. We do our best. But this world is pretty much against that from day one. I mean, when you have preteens that are exposed to these things, you wonder why we have such a high birth rate amongst teenagers. It's the environment they get exposed to and the environment they live in. When I was a kid, the worst thing I could do was ride in the back of the bus. That's where I learned all the things I wasn't supposed to learn. They don't even have to ride the bus now. They can just get a cell phone, and they got it. Anything, TikTok, Instagram, any of those social media platforms, your children are going to be exposed to things that they should not be exposed to yet. And no matter how much we try and how much we put limits on it, they're going to see it because one of their friends does it. We can block them all we want, but somehow that exposure is going to get out. So now we have to teach them, address it. It's awkward because we have to do it at such a younger age now. They may not fully understand it. We don't fully understand it. But it's something we have to talk to our children about to let them understand that curiosity is there, what's right and what's wrong. Don't let your children get an unhealthy expectation of what sexual intimacy is, what marriage should be, and all those things, because that's what causes the issues later down the road when they start trying to find a spouse or when they start discovering for themselves what it is. As parents, that's kind of our duty. As Christians, that's our duty to our children is protect them, educate them. Because if we don't, somebody else will. And it probably won't be to our expectations or our standards. So keep that in mind. And I've got two girls. It's not easy. It's not easy. I guess it wasn't easy when you had boys either. I don't know. I thought I was pretty easy growing up, but it's a rough world that we live in. Verse 26. I suppose, therefore, that this is good because of the present distress, that it is good for a man to remain as he is. So we kind of mentioned this present crisis, and now we're going to really dive into it. When Paul talks about the present crisis or present distress, it's good for a man to remain as he is. What's he alluding to?
Well, you're only responsible for one person.
You're only responsible for one person.
You run faster by yourself than you can try to pull somebody else with you. Get protection, cover, and hiding. Even hiding.
Yep.
It's hard to keep too. And this is very simple in the situation that they were in. They were killing Christians right and left, turning them.
The persecution coming up, leading to the reign of Nero and everything, what was to come. And there was an example given of a pastor who was being tortured to denounce Christ, and he wouldn't do it until they brought his son in and started torturing him. And that's what broke him. His love for his son made him denounce his faith. And that's what Paul's alluding to here is we become more vulnerable to sin and Satan when we have that family dynamic. Not that it's not God ordained and it's not a blessing to have a family. It's just understanding that will create more that you have to defend against evil now that you have a wife and children and not just yourself. It can be done. But here, a combination of severe, immediate pressures facing the early church, likely including economic hardships, famines, social instability leading up to Nero's reign, and risking persecution, all intensified by Paul's belief in the imminent return of Jesus, making undivided service to God the priority over the complexities of marriage. And also understand, too, in Paul's age, most people were already married with children before that time in his life. He also addresses that to some of the women that were widowed or unmarried because of their age in the culture then. The woman was supposed to be married by a certain age and bearing children by a certain age, and once she got over a certain age, it was less likely to happen. And so were they as valuable to a husband as a younger wife that could bear children, thinking of the times that they lived in society there. So he addresses those that could remain as he is, whether it be due to age or of their strength or their faith in Christ to remain single and not burn with passion. Because like he goes on in verse 27, are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be loosed. Are you loosed from a wife? Do not seek a wife. Going back to what he was talking about earlier, remain where you are or start where you begin. Verse 28, even if you do marry, you have not sinned. If a virgin marries, she has not sinned. Nevertheless, such will have trouble in the flesh, but I would spare you. As Kelly alluded to, and what they allude to here, if you do or do not married, you have not sinned, but you will likely face many different troubles in married life that are different than if you were single. But it always goes back to Paul's point in verse 9. And looking back to where I am now and the things that we faced, I could not imagine facing this life without Lydia, without my wife. I could not imagine doing life without her. Because of the experiences we have, we've written those chapters. So now we've got those chapters left unwritten that we're really looking forward to. I feel like we're stronger together than we are when we are apart in everything, including our faith. So now I've got the teammate. I've got that companionship. I've got somebody I can lean on. She has somebody she can lean on. Together we're stronger. That unity in numbers. I did go through a time, we all went through a time of being single, and some Christians single before we got married or after an unfortunate instance of separation or death. We take that in our walk with Christ, in our strengths, to be where we are and walk where we are. And I guess that was the next question I had was, why would Paul encourage us not to get married? As we just read through all these things. Would it be easier? I think that's a matter of opinion. Honestly, I think that was a matter of Paul's opinion. It was easier for him. Some of you that have remained single, you can probably be of the opinion that it was probably easier for you. For someone in my age, probably not. For me, I don't know that it'd be possible.
He lays it out. He says, okay, if your passions are so that you can't handle it,
Get married. Don't burn with passion.
handle your passion and keep it under subjection, then it's good.
Yep.
But he said, don't let it
consume you.
can handle it.
Don't let it put a stumbling block between you and God. He won't mind. I think of Lydia's grandpa J.L. when Miss Barbara passed away. He was as strong as he could be until he couldn't be anymore. And God brought him another wife, another spouse. And there was a lot of conversation of, is this scriptural? Is this in his mind, in his belief, in his study? It was good. His covenant with his first wife was fulfilled until death did they part. And now he's in a new covenant with another. And is it different than it was with his first wife? I'm sure it is. He was not able to remain as he was single. Even in his elder years, he needed that companionship. That being alone was just too much to bear. And so, going back to what Paul's telling us here is, if you can remain single, great, that's a blessing. If you can't, find you a Christian spouse, get remarried, it's a blessing. Whatever it takes for you to be focused on God, if you need a companion, get a companion. Because I don't think we'd have gone through all this talk about marriage if it wasn't a God-ordained and a blessing from God to have that. He didn't create Eve because Adam was perfect and Adam had everything he needed, right? When God created Adam, he looked down and saw that Adam was incomplete. Adam needed something. He was missing something. He brought all these animals forward, did not find a companion suitable enough for Adam. So he took a rib, he created another being, woman, from man, for his perfect companion. And they were united. They were perfect with each other. So I think that's where it all sums up on marriage. So in verse 29, but this I say, brethren, the time is short, so that from now on even those who have wives should be as though they had none, those who weep as though they did not weep, and those who rejoice as though they did not rejoice, those who buy as though they did not possess, and those who use this world as not misusing it. For the form of this world is passing away. So what does Paul mean here? So from now on, even those who have wives should be as though they had none. He's not telling them to go on like you're not married, to just live freely as not being bound to the covenant that you made with your spouse. He's basically telling us we should give our undivided focus to Christ. And that is what he's alluding to being married. It's a little bit harder to do because now you have to look at the attention and focus of a family and meeting their needs and not taking your focus off of Christ.
But if you're both Christians, I think it's easier to encourage.
Absolutely. And I think that's another thing that he's alluding to here with believers and unbelievers is don't unyoke yourself from them because you could save them. You could, through your faith and your actions, bring that person to Christ, and then you have that unity and that strong, that more strength.
An example is two ox pulling together.
Yep.
It's a lot easier than an ox and a donkey
Yep. An uneven yoke.
or a goat or whatever you want to.
Yep.
Than an ox. Two pairing alike, thinking alike, working alike will make it. You pull it up.
Why'd they call it a team? Because not everyone is doing their own part to make the whole team move forward. And I also remember reading and people talking about it, you always had one that was stronger than the others. You had the one that was the leader. So it had a certain position in the yoke to lead the others. But you also staggered them where you had a strong, maybe a weaker one and a strong one. That way the strong could help the weak become stronger, being yoked together like that. So even in being unequally yoked, if you have the right dynamic, the right focus, you can help bring the other ones up to be as strong as the others. So we
Also used an old one to teach and guide the younger one to come along.
Yep.
New ox with the old one.
It was a whole lot easier to train a young one when you had a more mature one that was already trained, that knew it. So I always thought with horses, they would always put the lead horse, the older horse with the younger ones to learn the G's and the haws and what they did, because when you made that command, that older mature horse is going to do it. The young one didn't have a choice. And after a while, it started to associate when it started hearing what the other one, so it basically, the older one trained itself. We do that with kids. We use our older children to train our younger children sometimes. If we have them trained right, they're going to follow the lead of that older child.
It's just about every trade is like that too. You have a journeyman, you have a
Yep.
master, you have an apprentice, so it all kind of be trained to other people.
And so going back to some of those statistics that we read that were so unfortunate about those that married not understanding what marriage was, they didn't have that example growing up as to what a marriage should have been. So they don't have an expectation of what it needs to be, and divorce is too easy. Especially man's law. You look at the state of Arkansas or any of the other states, they have laws governing that. A lot of times it's embarrassing to talk about getting a marriage counselor or going to see a therapist or get counseling or help. A marriage counselor is probably going to be a whole lot cheaper than a divorce attorney. It's probably going to be a whole lot simpler process too. Even within the church, there is a group, and me and Lydia have gone to one of their seminars. It's Trey and Leah's, the Morgans Stronger Marriages seminars. They're awesome. They're great. And he tells you, these are not for marriages that are struggling. These are for marriages that want to be strengthened. Because if you wait until you're struggling or you need help, it's going to be a whole lot harder to overcome if you don't start nurturing that marriage while it's healthy, to make it healthier. They have some great stuff in there, some things that we still pull out and think about and refer to. And they're very successful. It's almost hard to get them booked and hard to get into one of those seminars because they're Bible-based. They're based on Scripture. And so it's a really neat, so if you have that opportunity, no matter where you are, in pre-marriage counseling, that was another thing that I strongly encourage young people to do. Pre-marriage counseling. Address some issues before they become issues, because there's a lot of things that you think you're in unity on until you get faced with that question and you're like, oh, how are we going to handle that? Disciplining your children. When it came to those of different faiths, the question was asked, where are you going to go to church? If you haven't discussed that, you got to discuss it. Do it now before you're married, because it's going to be really uneven yoked when you have a husband going to this church and a wife going to that church. May work out while they're married, but then they have children. Who do the children go with? Mom or dad? their faith is going to be divided. So things like that you address while you can, so that we can give our undivided focus to Christ. And so he's telling us basically, time is short. Paul felt like this because of the things that were going on, the persecution they were facing. Time was short for him. They knew some of the persecution, and we think about it today. We think about time, and we're blessed, and we have all these great things that we've got all the time in the world, and we really don't. We really do not know when our last day is. And so basically focus on Christ like tomorrow or the next minute is the minute He's coming. That way you are prepared. Whether you're married, single, with children, without children. And don't be attached to the world. And that's one of the things that a lot of the people they encountered, the worldliness was the one thing they couldn't let go of. The money, the status, all those things are things they could not let go of to follow Christ. He says in verse 32, I want you to be without care. He who is unmarried cares for the things of the Lord, how he may please the Lord. But he who is married cares about the things of the world, how he may please his wife. There is a difference between a wife and a virgin. The unmarried woman cares about the things of the Lord, that she may be holy both in body and in spirit. But she who is married cares about the things of the world, how she may please her husband. And this I say for your own profit, not that I may put a leash on you, but for what is proper, that you may serve the Lord without distraction. In this part is kind of where the concept came to me of nuns, of monks, those that have taken the vow of celibacy to devote themselves for Christ, and they unite themselves with others that are like-minded to help them carry on. I don't see those that want to live that life. If they've made that commitment, they've made that decision between them and God, that's their covenant. Let them live. But now, Paul tells us here that if they can't handle that lifestyle, have they sinned if they break away and go get married? Don't burn with passion. Verse 36, if any man thinks he is behaving improperly towards his virgin, if she is past the flower of youth, and thus it must be, let him do it as he wishes. He does not sin, let them marry. Nevertheless, he who stands steadfast in his heart, having no necessity, but has power over his own will, and has so determined in his heart that he will keep his virgin, does well. So then he who gives her in marriage does well, but he who does not give her in marriage does better. A wife is bound by law as long as her husband lives. But if her husband dies, she is at liberty to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord. But she is happier if she remains as she is, according to my judgment, and I think I also have the Spirit of God. All right, so we're winding down on our. The final summation here is you're bound to your spouse as long as they are alive. And I guess that's where we get till death do us part. I've always wondered, where did all these marriage vows that everybody recite, where did that come from? Because it's not like you find it in Scripture word for word, the marriage vows, but you pull out little snippets of it. The death till death do you part, in sickness and in health, and all those things that we recite, basically making that covenant. So, recapping all of this, when he talks to marriage to the church at Corinth, what were the things that he laid out? All right, so as far as marriage, it's a covenant between man and woman and God. Sexual intimacy is a strong part of that relationship. Respect is a strong part of that relationship. It cannot be uneven. It has to be even between husband and wife, their duties, their affection for each other, their commitment to each other. Divorce comes in death, in abandonment, in adultery. It's also one of those that goes between them and God. when we talked about forgiveness, can that be forgiven? Yes. God has that power. It may be harder for us to forgive ourselves or forgive those, but God can. And if God can, we should. He lays out in that unfortunate incident who's bound, who isn't. There's instructions on that. Even Paul said it's better to remain united, but if it's not possible after that, there is the grounds for divorce. One of the things we didn't cover is, outside of that, you've got unfortunate instances of abuse, whether it be physical or mental abuse from one spouse to the other. Complete abandonment. They just pack up and leave, abandon the spouse and children or whatnot. The state laws have different boundaries as to what covenant constitutes an offense for divorce. What was that one I read? Unreconcilable differences. That's a pretty broad window. We couldn't agree on where to eat supper. We're getting divorced. I don't think any couple can survive that decision.
Really, when you mash it down and put it together, as long as God's in the middle of it, things will be okay.
Yep.
It's when one or the other moves away from the center. And that's when the problem, and Malachi says God hates divorce.
Yep, we went over those verses where it's strongly discouraged.
But that doesn't make God like it.
Yep.
That's a real strong point there.
It is, but also go back to that point that even in my sins I can be forgiven.
Yeah, I didn't say that.
Right.
I didn't say that. He just said he hates divorce.
Yep. Well, because it's a breaking of a covenant. Because it's the same as breaking the covenant between you and God. When you don't live up to those agreements that you made with God, for whatever reasons, you broke that covenant. And I think that's why Paul's making such a big deal of this. He's like, because marriage is not an easy task.
The deal is that it's never just, injury is never just to the two people.
Right. There's always...
It goes on for generations sometimes.
I think God uses the word hate, that's pretty
Pretty
severe.
strong.
Yeah. Absolutely.
To say that it's okay, I think is, and to say that we're all covered by grace, I think you've really got to stretch what God's trying to say there.
Yep.
Quiet in here.
This is not an easy subject. This is not an easy subject. It's not an easy study. But again, it's something that if we don't address, we don't have the correct expectations or knowledge of how to handle things like this when they arise. Be it what it may, if we depend on somebody else, we're usually not going to get fulfilled if we're not in the Word, studying the Word, focusing on the Word, and talking about those things that are hard to talk about. Begin where you are.
And Jason, I just want to say, I think you've done a great job on it, and it's going over each one of these things, but we do need to back up and look at it whole. This is something Paul is writing to the church there in Corinthians. It's not just the one thing we're talking about each Sunday morning. It's about multiple things he's talking about. I mean, at the beginning of it, it's a letter.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he goes through all these bad things that the church is doing. They need to change their mind. They're changing the way they do stuff. But then in the end of the letter, he praises them.
Yeah.
So there is, we are use it as lessons to our lives to how we should live 100%. And some of them are hard topics. And that's because sometimes we make it hard topics.
We gain knowledge by asking the questions.
Yeah, the way we want to see it, it's hard, but it is what it is.
It is what it is. And His law is, it doesn't change, it's steadfast. And I found that interesting through this study is even though this letter was written to the first early church of the Corinthians, It still applies to us today. And I look through some of these things like these are still situations that we are faced with today. Questions we get today, how do we address them? The answer is not always the answer we want to hear. It's not always the easiest answer to live by. But it's the answer. And if we want to remain in God, we have to live by His law. We have to respect His law and, again, start where we are. That's the end of the time. I really thank you all for your attention. Who's got chapter 8? Joe Moore picks up with chapter 8. So looking forward to it. Thank you.